Hi there, friends! I'd like to share with you a used book that caught my wife's eye for 50 whole cents while we were on vacation this summer. And there couldn't be a more perfectly named book series for me to tear into. The Best of Trek, which was an every few years periodical from the late 70s through the early 90s, that highlighted some of Trek magazine's best articles. Specifically, I here at Best of Trek, Worst of Trek am going to review a 36-year-old review from Best of Trek. If you're confused, let's work through it. This book contains Trek's original 1987 review of TNG's first episode, Encounter at Farpoint, as written by co-founder of the magazine and writer Walter Irwin. I'm going to mostly paraphrase except for a couple of choice excerpts, as to not trigger any kind of copyright dispute. Let's use that sweet, sweet benefit of hindsight, and the like-dislike system from my initial thoughts videos, and see what, in its day, was the penultimate standard for a fan review of Trek's first reboot series. The article starts by laying out the preceding rumors of what the show might be, including a Captain Sulu, First Officer Savick combo, which could have been an awesome choice. Some people thought we would see Strange New Worlds more than 30 years before it debuted. The big question it asks in the first paragraph, though, is what we did get Star Trek. We're off to a good start with a like for asking the right big question. However, I've got a dislike for starting the next paragraph by identifying the title of the episode as Journey to Farpoint. If this was a review in USA Today or something, I'd forgive them for not getting the title right, but Trek magazine gets no such understanding. It gets another dislike for saying that we got an incomplete look at the Enterprise D. We saw all the major set pieces, and though they wouldn't have known at the time, even a look at the little-used battle bridge, which would see more use as a redressed version of alien ship bridges. I want to give a like, but I'm not going to for claiming the episode was entirely successful, in that it effectively introduced our main characters, but was less successful of a story. For me, this is easily Trek's worst two-parter, and the Farpoint story is so far from engaging. However, the reason I'm giving this statement a dislike is that it goes on to slam the Q character, which for me is the only part of the episode worth watching. The author did not like how Q forced Picard to make a choice, and something about a false influence of suspense. Being able to look back and watch the trial of humanity play out through TNG from exonerated to the jury still being out to its conclusion in All Good Things. From my perspective, it was real suspense right from the beginning of this episode. The author also took issue with a godlike alien whose powers are undefined and not understood because it's somehow not sci-fi or something. I just view it as a society that's a 2 or more on the Kardashev scale. Quote, "We are left with yet another childish, spiteful, petty, tin-plated super alien acting like a complete ass, simply for the purposes of the plot." While Q is not super well-rounded in his first appearance, he's also the most interesting thing going on in this otherwise plot to nowhere. The author would rather have seen Q be cool and collected, having a civilized debate. Yeah, that's another dislike for me. While it would be more in keeping with most of the TOS higher civilizations we've met, it also sets TNG apart from its predecessor early on, and I think that would have made this a snooze fest of an episode even more boring. The highly animated Q was a good choice to pad out the original script to its feature-length runtime. I finally have another like for stepping into the Farpoint mystery plot and calling it not a lot more original. The biggest in-universe problem that I agree with the author on is that Starfleet wouldn't have just shown up after a new base was completed to survey it, but would have been involved in every step of the process. There's no reason to turn building over to a race whose cities are nothing but poorly constructed models. Here comes a quote that's about to get a dislike. There is no doubt Patrick Stewart as Captain Picard is the star of the show, although not a particularly impressive physical specimen. Look, we can't all have Scott Bakula's late 80s chest, and thankfully the show wouldn't become known for Picard having his poorly fitting uniform torn away every few episodes like TOS. And if I'm not becoming a broken record yet, here's another dislike for an assumption that feels like the author heard about the episode secondhand. Quote, "The ship is new to Picard, but not brand new." That's pretty well established at the beginning of the episode. While we didn't get the motion picture level of flying around the galaxy class in space dock before the mission began, it's established it's a brand new ship on its first mission. I will give the author a like for deducing some of Picard's character traits correctly about taking everyone's advice, never acting impulsively, and not running bluffs as if the Corbomite maneuver is always the best course of action. The review then moves on to Riker and points out there's actually not a lot to go off from Frakes to base an early profile on regarding the character. But take a like for pointing out his best scene is with Data in the holodeck. A scene that will come to have layers of meaning throughout TNG into Picard. Before moving on, if you're enjoying the review, please consider a like and subscribe. I'm going to give a dislike, though, for assuming that the new Big Three will consist of Picard, Riker, and Troy just because they sit mid-bridge together, and even going as far as to say Bev will likely make a Big Four. I'm glad TNG used their ensemble cast better than TOS, and the constant pair of the same three characters that leaves me to believe Scotty was in command more than Kirk on the original Enterprise. The review goes a step further, saying Worf, Geordi, and Yar will be featured but never be the stars of the show. You got 1 out of 3 there, but that transitions to a like, for then assuming Data will likely take center stage more often than the rest. I'm going to quote the book that's quoting just what must be general sentiment at the time more than a direct quote. Data is the worst idea about the show. With the benefit of hindsight, this is one of the most striking things in this article. To think the character that would go on to be many people's favorite was thought of poorly before the debut feels extremely weird. I have a dislike here, and not for the above quote, but for saying Data is not the Spock character of the show, but more like McCoy just because they had that one scene together. I don't in any way see McCoy in Data, but he's 100% the Spock character of the show, even from episode 1. Here's a like for tying Geordi into the real quadriplegic Trek fan of similar name that inspired the character. Sadly, George LaForge wouldn't live to see TNG's pilot, but good on Roddenberry for including a handicapped person of color because of a fan he got to know. The synopsis of Yar is pretty middle of the road, but I've got a like for it then tying into Worf saying they seem as part of a team dealing with weapons, sensors, and comms. Trek magazine didn't know how right it would become here. The article postulates a couple of possible backstories for Worf, and actually hits it on the nose about being rescued by Federation personnel. The early days of Klingons in TNG gave you weird clues that were ultimately deceiving, like the first Klingon ship we encounter in Season 1 has a Federation emblem behind the captain, as if the Klingon Empire had folded into Starfleet. I've got a like as the article moves to Deanna guessing correctly that this is a character that will experience the most change going forward. I find it an interesting dynamic that the character almost instantly gets better in Season 1 itself, into Season 2, but actually slips back to this painfully mediocre character we first see in the pilot through Seasons 3 through 7, not fully redeeming herself until episodes of Voyager and Picard. Moving on to Blaze and Bev, I've got a dislike because, quote, Beverly is competent, a little bit sassy, and darned good looking. She didn't get to doctor at all in this episode, so competent is open to interpretation. I wouldn't say she's sassy in the pilot, though that is a trait that develops. Good looking, Well, you're certainly entitled to your opinion of 80s soap opera actresses. I don't have much to say about the article's little to say about Wesley from the pilot. As the article starts to wrap up, I've got a dislike for stating, "The special effects are wonderful." Even for the 80s, there wasn't much impressive. Destroying a poorly built model was garbage. The space jellyfish, well, existed. And Q's ball of screen material is pretty underwhelming. When you consider the first episode had a $10 million budget, it's only okay. Could someone please help me with another quote that accompanies the effects piece in saying, "But the shift to videotape is sometimes a little jarring." While I did not see this in first run, I saw it numerous times on cheap CRT TVs back in the day. Usually this would mean a show like this that's primarily shooting on film, cutting in a shot stored on magnetic tape. But I honestly don't remember seeing this in TNG. If you do, please comment below what scenes you remember looking like this. The article finally gets to the $64,000 question. Is it Star Trek? And Trek Magazine gets a like for me for saying yes. While I personally think Encounter at Farpoint is one of the worst episodes of Trek ever, and easily its worst two-parter, it's exactly what TOS fans had come to expect from a formula. An alien entity testing humanity while humanity tests its limits of understanding of the cosmos. At a core level, the episode does what its core audience expected. I've got another like for surmising that TNG would become the Trek show people talked about. The show that ends up on all the merch and becomes the centerpiece of conversations. To this day, it is still probably the most iconic series in most people's minds. Even if the first two seasons were often problematic. I've got one final like for saying that it's up to us fans to make the show a success. The writers can put out a perfect 10 of an episode, but if we as viewers don't watch or carry our elation with us, it's just another episode of television. I'm going to quote the entire final paragraph here. When you get down to it, friends, it doesn't matter if the next generation is real Star Trek. It doesn't matter, because we are the real Star Trek. Koala bless you, Walter Irwin. I wish you'd been around to preach that sentiment in the age of New Trek. This article was a bit all over the place in terms of both predictions and even what was plainly being talked about in the episode, but its conclusions are mostly sound. I thoroughly enjoyed digging into this time capsule, and who better than us at Best of Trek to review the Best of Trek review of a 35-year-old episode of television that, while not great, spawned one of the best television shows of all time. Though, just saying, if I had been in charge of programming at Paramount, I might have asked Roddenberry for a second pilot. Again, a show that has all the makings of a classic with an unfortunately lackluster plot.